Hello, this is Joanne May, and today I have a tutorial on 4 watercolor techniques. The first is wet on wet bleeding of the paint. The second is damp brush lifting off of the paint off the paper. The third is a light water spray to create texture, and the fourth is using the end of your brush, the back end of your brush, to create lines. The final part of this video will be a painting using these 4 techniques of this young lady, and it will be a line and wash. So you'll see me do the outline with a Micron pen and then go into the watercolor techniques. So I hope you enjoy the video, and I will hope that you will like and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching. Let's get started. I'm starting with a number 4 round Grumbacher brush, dipping it into the water, and the brush is very wet. Water is almost dripping off of the brush, and I'm just making a letter S there in the upper left-hand corner of the paper just for some fun. And what I'll do next is get a lot of paint on the brush and touch where the water is, just at the top of that letter S, and you see that immediately the paint goes where the water is. This wet on wet technique is what attracts people to doing watercolor. It does what it's going to do. You have some control because you lay the water onto the paper and you put it in a certain shape, and you can touch around a little bit like I did there. My surface is slightly raised up at the top, so probably only about 5 degrees, not very far up. But you see now as I touch at the bottom there, you can see that there's paint that's going a little bit to the outer edges of the bottom of the S, and the center is still left pale. So the paint will flow in the water. Sometimes, depending on how much water there is, it'll stay pretty even, and sometimes it'll go shooting toward the edge. Here I'm using a different shape, and when I touched at the top of this shape, it didn't look like it wanted to flow very much, but you see the water moving around inside of that shape because the paint is following where the water is. Just such an important concept to keep in mind always when you're doing watercolor. Wherever the water is, that's where the paint will go if you have a lot of water. And now touching at the bottom, even though I'm lifting this up, it's going uphill because it will follow where the water is. And as this pink color comes toward the top where the blue is, you'll see lavender start to appear. And so once again, the watercolor process is partly your control and partly it's just going to do what water will do. Now I'm wetting a big square, and I'm going to start by just dotting some color in, and you'll see what happens with the flow of the color. I'll start with a green. Notice what's happening up there as it dries too. The paint actually dries first on the edges of a strip like that where the S is. But look what happened there. It's like fireworks. You put the dot, touch the paint to the water, and it explodes. If I make a line, it flows outward in all directions as I'm moving the brush across. Now I'm adding some dots. Some of those dots are smaller, so you can see that the firework look to it is smaller or larger depending on how much paint I add in there. I picked up yellow next, and yellow has a way of flowing more aggressively than most other colors. You see if I dot it right there into the green, it gets pushy. It pushes the other color out of the way instead of wanting to blend. But actually what happens is it'll be pushy like that at first, but as it begins to dry, it starts to blend better and create a beautiful yellowish green, which I like to use for spring grasses and leaves. Now in this area I'm doing a circle, and you'll see purple, I believe, is what I picked up first, and the purple didn't move nearly as much as the yellow. Look what happened there. There was a lot of water in there. There, even more water toward the right side, so it did start to move a little more, but that first touch was nothing like what happened with the green and the yellow. So each pigment has its own characteristics, and it's something that you can learn by just playing like this. Just grab yourself a little swatch of paper, watercolor paper. If you have 100% cotton, that works the best. But any watercolor paper would do this. And now what I'm doing is just, you see the color disappearing? The brush is now wet, clean. I rinsed it in clean water, and then I just wiped it off so that it's damp, but it's not wet anymore. And when it's damp, wherever the surface has the most water, it will flow into the area of the least amount of water. So my brush becomes, if it's not as wet, will pick up the water, which means it also picks up the pigment. So now that brings us to this damp brush technique of lifting out color. So I'm just putting down some ultramarine blue here, and the edges are fairly faint. I like that shade if I'm making a sky. I don't want so much of that dark blue in the sky, so what I'm going to do is just do what I just mentioned. I'm going to dampen my brush, make sure it's clean, wipe it off on a paper towel so that it's not dripping wet anymore, it's just damp. And then I will, see, I'm just wiping it off right there. And now I will just set it into that darker area, lay it there for just a few seconds, and then pull. And you see it just takes the pigment right away. So if you have a mistake where you want to lift up the color, this is how you would do it. And once again, I'll do another area. If it's wet, really wet still on the paper where that blue is, it'll lift off more easily. If it starts to dry, and in this area it had just started to dry right at the edge of the darker color, you see it doesn't come up very well. So what I needed to do if I wanted to lift out was get my brush just a little bit wetter, just dipped it back in and just touched the paper towel this time. And did you see me scrub just a little bit? That also can help to loosen up the pigment. Different papers will soak up the pigment in different ways as well. So sometimes it works better, sometimes not as well, depending on the type of paper that you have. And so there you see I was able, with some patience now, going back over 2 or 3 times to get almost back to the white of the paper. Now I'll do a little more, and this is something that I've used for creating sparkles on water. I don't want to have real wide swatches of white paper showing, but maybe some thinner lines. So with my damp brush, now I'm just going over a thin area 3 or 4 times and then touching it with a paper towel or a Kleenex, and you see how that paper towel actually helped the lifting process, take some of the pigment away. A little bit more of the same. See how much that helps to have the pigment. You can see it comes off on the paper towel. So that's damp brush lifting. I'm going to do one more little spot here so that you can see it doesn't always have to be lines or the shape of the brush. I can just go in and scrub a little circle, and it'll have a little bit harder line on the front edge and a little softer line at the back edge where there's more water. And there you have it. Okay, and now the light water spray technique. This one is, first I will be wetting the paper and then laying in some paint. I like to use this for texture. It's a beautiful look. It's subtle. If you use you'll need a spray bottle. Any kind of spray bottle will do. Some people like sprays that leave really big droplets of water on the paper. Others like the finer mist of a spray. This bottle that I'm using is a fairly fine mist, but it's actually really interesting to see what happens after you spray it. So this is pretty wet. I was pointing around the edges because it is starting to get it's not getting dry, it's just soaking, the water is soaking into the paper. And I just sprayed it 2 times, just like that. Now you have to wait. You have to be patient with this one because once again the watercolor and the moisture will do the work for you. If you're looking for texture in clothing or in hair, like you'll see in the painting that I do, or if you want texture in rock formations or landscapes, this is a great way. And I'm not touching the paper right now. I'm just finding where these little droplets have landed on the pigment and then started to push, just like you saw that wet on wet process. That's what's happening here as well, but in little tiny circles. So you'll see some of that texture in the final painting. And now I'm just waiting, letting it dry a little bit more, and I see more and more of those little bits of white paper showing through where the droplets have landed. This makes a nice starry night sky as well. Okay, our 4th technique is end of brush, using the end of the brush to create some lines. This is a great technique for tree branches, and you'll see that I use it for the ends of this young lady's hair when I'm painting the final painting. So I'm just making a tree trunk here with some thick branches up above. One thing to keep in mind about this technique is that you need a lot of paint and a significantly large amount of water. You see me dropping a lot of pigment, and I have a lot of water on the brush and on the paper right here. And where these smaller branches are going to be, I'll take the back end of my brush. It's rounded so I can get a fairly fine connection with a small point, and going across the paper in the shape of a branch. I'm not getting a lot right there on the first go around because I didn't have enough pigment at the top of those branches. So I'm just adding more pigment and immediately going with the brush fairly straight up and down. And it makes for really fine lines. It's fairly easy to do. Where you want more, you just add more paint along the thicker part of the branch, and then just take the bottom end and make some branch shaped lines or hair shaped lines, whatever you are making, whatever you're painting. Add pigment and then use the end of the brush. It's a fun way to do little fine lines, and you can make them in any shape that you need them to be. One thing I'm talking about right here, or thinking about right here, is that sometimes you can get white lines if you have something sharp. The end of the brush isn't quite sharp enough to create white lines inside of a wet wash like the trunk. but if you had a credit card, the edge of a gift card, something like that, you can actually scrape out the pigment so you get some white lines as well. That works really nicely for veins of leaves, to do some of this dark end of brush lineage, and then do some scraping out with some white lines, since nature has all of those varieties of the way leaves would look, or branches. So, okay, here we go now with this design. This was something that I just pulled off of Pixabay. I don't know if you know about pixabay.com. I'll put that into the description below. This is a free source of images and videos and music, all royalty free. So this was just one of the designs, and I thought this would work really well to do this painting as a line and wash. I started with the Micron pen, and I did the outline, and now I'm laying in the wash with a little bit of that lifting out. You may have seen it at the top of her forehead. It was a little bit darker. I wanted it to be lighter against her darker hair, so I lifted out a little bit, but you'll see more of that later. Now I'm laying in a lighter wash of her hair color. One thing about watercolors, you want to layer from light to dark. So always start with your lightest colors, or I should say most of the time. It's not always. Nothing is ever always. But start with the process usually would be lighter color first, and then you see how I'm adding some darker shades in here. I'm mixing, I believe that was burnt sienna with neutral tint, which is almost a black neutral tint. Makes every color darker if you mix it in. And now I'm going back over some of the lighter browns with a darker shade. This area underneath her cheek will eventually be almost black because that's in a shadow a little bit. So far I'm just laying in, and now there you see me using the end of the brush to pull out some of the ends of the hair, and it makes a really natural look to the hair on the edges there. You'll see me do that right here on her forehead as well. At first I didn't have very much pigment, now I'm adding more pigment. I'm also going to want that to be darker. So the layers of color, if you start with this lighter shade and then add a little bit more depth, a little more darkness, and you get more dimension in the painting. So it's nice to use this variety. Also, when mixing pigments, many watercolor artists prefer to just use the 3 primaries and mix every other shade. Start with red, yellow, and blue, and mix so that you get a purple or an orange or a green or any other shades, cool shades and warm shades, because it adds more depth and more dimension to the painting. So here, more hair pulling out from the end of the brush. All of this is from the first layer. I started with a wet brush full of paint on dry paper, but all of these layers on top then are wet on wet. So I'm trusting that even if I don't get my brush to lay the paint in exactly where I want it, that there will be bleeding going on constantly when it's wet. So I'm using quite a lot of water through this whole process. And so the wet on wet technique is the one that you'll use the most in watercolor of the 4 that I showed you today. There was a little bit of a spray, so I'm spraying for some texture in the hair. Now with a really dark combination of brown and black, although it will look black when this is finished. Doing the eyes, trying to make sure I leave the white of the paper, or actually, since I had done a wash of skin tone, even though those sparkles in her eyes look white, they're actually that skin tone color. And the only thing you haven't seen so far is the damp brush lifting out, other than just a little dab at the forehead. So you will see that in the hair. There, I'm adding some darker streaks to her hair. Here's some wet on wet. I laid in water, now just dropping in this pink pigment. And the water just takes the pigment and spreads it out for you. Here, because I had some pigment already on my brush, I just went in wet on dry. So there are lots of ways. There was some lifting, if you saw me, with too much water on that right hand side of her clothing, so I took my brush, cleaned it off, dabbed it off on a paper towel, then touched it into her clothing and lifted it right out. There's another lifting process right on the edge of her clothing where I had gotten a little past where I wanted that color to be, so I just cleaned my brush, wiped it off on a paper towel, scrubbed a little bit on the area where the pink went over into her skin, and then touched it with a paper towel, and it came right up. Now the rest of the skin tone, and I used a little more of a spritz. I'm not sure if that's going to be seen. Here's where I'm now lifting out, where some of the highlights of where I'm imagining that there would be light reflecting off of her hair, mainly on the top side, thicker lines, thinner lines, and directional lines, because I'm imagining that, of course, her hair would be moving in various directions. So there you have it. These 4 techniques put together into a painting, something that you can do very easily, and hope you would have some fun with this project. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope to see you next time.